Mm. All right, thank you. So yeah, welcome everyone. So first announcement is I don't believe we have a meeting next week. So we'll put on the agenda. There would not be any meeting next week unless John, you tell me otherwise.
Oh, that sounds fine.
Okay, yeah, I'll put on the meeting minutes. I think we only have one agenda on the meeting.
Do we have a meeting the week after? On the 28th, are we doing one?
Probably not. Who is going to be here?
I'm just going to assume no.
Yeah, I'll put in the notes so we don't have any meetings. Yeah. Next up, Yossi, I'd like you to take over the discussion of cTunnel layer 4 policy designs. I know there's a little bit of disagreement, so Yossi, go ahead.
Yeah, is Kostin here? Yeah, okay. So I kind of summarized the open issues or the open concerns that we have over the ideas and the message that is defined in this design document. The message itself is, the protobuf is kind of a living protobuf. I'm updating the protobuf based on the feedback that I get from the people over here. I know that I still need to target Limin concern about the logic of O and AND. So it will probably be updated further, but there is a bigger or much more deeper question which Kostin raises in his comments, and and if I understand it correctly, it's whether why we are not using the Istio authorization policy protobuf in order to pass the information between the control plane and the Z tunnel. And if I read between the lines of Kostin's comments, there is also a hidden question whether we actually want and Kostin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, whether we actually need a new external API for that, or we can use one of the existing MCP XDS API that will allow us to filter, basically do some basic filtering on the resources that we want, but the Z tunnel can get the Istio authorization policy resources from the control plane. Am I correct, Kostin?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, even today, you can get the resources from zTunnel to IstioD with the existing protocol. I'm not saying we should not change the syntax of we can change the actual URLs that we use to retrieve it to be something different and put the filter so it's backward compatible. But even with the existing IstioD with no changes whatsoever, it is implementable already. So you can ask for give me all the policies. Rust can very easily, process the existing Istio policies, and if you can show how the different proto will be easier to implement in Rust, I would agree with a different proto, but I don't really see how if you move the fields a bit around, you make it easier to implement in Rust. You'll still iterate, you'll still create some internal maps, you'll still, if we find some Rust implementation of ACLs that it's in broad use is tested and we convert from our to whatever Rust already provides, if it exists, then then it's easy because we can just reuse a crate and do the translation in IstioD. I can live with that.
Just one comment before I pass it on to John and Limin. I don't think that the consideration over here was to whether it's simpler to implement in Rust or not. I mean, it's more about the what's the data and how can we scale the information better when we use this type of schema, a new schema that we can aggregate the policies, and I don't think that we ever considered or thought about whether it's like simpler to implement in Rust.
If it's just different, then what's the point? I mean, we're just inventing a new API that is doing pretty much the same thing with different words, and we don't really gain anything. We just delay the process because we need to implement it in STOD, we need to implement it in Rust, we need to keep it stable, and it's not going to be stable because probably iterate since it's a new API. Versus something that is stable, works, can be used today with no changes in STOD, maybe some optimizations later. John?
Yeah, the issue is that if we do that, we need to not just modify the auth-z. I mean, well, you do the unmodified, like you're saying, but we'd have to modify the workloads to send all the labels, and that would basically double the size of the workload proto.
Why would they need to?
Well, auth-z policy have a label selector, so if you're sending the auth-z policy as is, then how would you implement that if you don't have the workload labels?
Oh, but I saw that we do send labels in workloads.
No.
We don't send the...
Yeah.
Last time we discussed this was a challenge because we don't send the label, so you have to redo the work to figure out which policy or C policy is associated with which workload through the selector.
I'm confused. So there are two kinds of labels. One is sending the labels of, the in non-metadata like we sent today. And I think we have those. We don't have to send them and and the other is in the workload proto where we return the labels for the destination.
We don't return the labels in the workload proto.
I know, but my understanding is they're not used in the policy. I mean, we use the labels to select where they match, and that's not based on the remote, on the peer labels. But for peer, we only use information that is on the wire.
So, okay, if I have a auth-z policy that says match app equals foo, now I think you're proposing we send that policy as is directly to ztunnel, right?
Yes, more or less.
So now when ztunnel gets a request to the bar service, how does it know whether it should apply that auth-z policy or not?
So, but they will not get the labels from. I mean, isn't watching the pods? Don't you need to get some pod information about all the pods running on the node anyway, for
Right,
your local information, because it will be
we get that from the
allocations.
workload API.
Yeah. Oh, you get everything from even information about yourself, about local
Yes.
pods and annotations.
Yeah.
How do you implement annotations about we include exclude ports? How do you implement?
That's not handled by ztunnel. That's handled by the CNI.
Okay, so let me rephrase. The combination of whatever runs on the node, that I'm not proposing changes to the workload API, how to get labels. I'm proposing that ztunnel should be aware of more information. And yes, if you want to filter it, I'm okay with that as well. I mean, to have STOD do some pre-filtering and return a slightly different format, but not with changing the entire structure of the API and what is matched.
Okay, so you're saying we would basically, for only the local pods, you would get the labels, but not for all the pods, which then makes it scalable.
That's another option. Or we do pre-filtering. The problem with pre-filtering and STOD, I mean, STOD doing the label matching, is that if STOD goes out for a while or we have any problems, then a new pod starts on the node, and we may have a delay where the pod is running, but we don't necessarily know the pod policies because STOD couldn't send them.
Well, we won't know about the pod if STOD is not running, so we would have to block the traffic.
We block for startup, and at this point, the IP table annotations are known, so we know the labels already before we start. But STOD may be delayed, so I don't think we block until STOD sends all the authorization, because STOD will say, no, I don't know, I didn't receive yet the notification on the pod, I didn't match it, I will not.
No, so the ztunnel has to get all the info about the pods on its node from STOD. So if STOD is down, it won't get that info. And then when it gets a request, it will say, this IP address, I don't know who this is, and it will reject it. I mean, the thing giving the workloads in the RBAC is the same entity. So it seems like you can't really have an outage of auth-z without an outage of workload as well.
Okay, I'll need to think about it. But going back to the point, are you getting labels for the local workloads? Is it a problem with that? Do we think
We don't do it now. We could do it. One concern I have, and this is a much, much broader concern, is today we have the workload resource and it is not client specific, right? And so we actually don't do this today, but in theory, we could take that, pre-generate all the serialized protobufs and store them in a map and then just pipe those down like a CDN, right? And that could be in other implementations, even more like a CDN. If we make it so it's client aware, then we have to go regenerate it every time.
I understand your point.
So I mean, there is an alternative, like it's a different type or something. Like there are alternatives, certainly. I'm not saying it's a deal breaker, but it's just something we should keep in mind anytime we're making a client specific thing in workload. So
yeah, no, I think that we should. I agree with you. Workload, we may need different variation of workload protocol. I mean, with different names. Someone mentioned a question mark. I mean, a query parameter or a different URL syntax about what we return. So I'm trying to understand what is easier for us. I mean, to have these mechanisms to return labels with an alternative to workload or workload with labels or some other protocol, or to do the label matching in HTOD as a general rule. Is it the only case we have where we need to use labels? Then probably it's okay to go with matching labels in HTOD. Otherwise, maybe we should take the more general solution because.
Yeah, I think the other case we would need labels is when we add network policy, but I think that if we do this, we should use the same proto for OSCE policy and network policy. So zTunnel doesn't even need to care that they're the same or that they are different user-facing ones because they ultimately are representing the same information.
Do we need the labels in the telemetry or other places other than OSCE?
We don't put the labels in telemetry. No, we put a few labels, specific labels become things in telemetry, like the version label, but that's already part of the workload proto.
Okay. Yeah. So label information will be sent. It's just we may not use the label as the identifier for workloads inside the OSCE policy.
I wouldn't say label info will be sent. It's more like labels can configure some specific properties of the workload, like version, and the version is sent. But that's not the same as saying labels are sent because we don't send all the labels. We send very specific ones, and we're technically not sending the label. We're sending something that can be configured by a label, but it can also be configured by other means. Does that make sense?
Ethan.
I think I don't necessarily know the answer either way on this, but just as a general principle, I think it's a good idea to keep zTunnel as simple as possible and have as few kind of higher layer abstractions leak into the data plane as possible, particularly when you consider that ultimately we're going to expect alternative implementations, we're going to expect CNIs that build zTunnel-like functionality, implementing the same API. The thinner we can keep that and the more we can keep out of the data plane in terms of logic, I think the better. So I just wanted to kind of flag that.
Yeah, like one example where I think is kind of irritating is that the Istio API has like from to and then which are typed, and then when, which is just this arbitrary string thing that can match anything, and has like prefix and suffix matches and all this craziness. It certainly could be implemented in zTunnel, but it's kind of nice to not have to worry about that and just get kind of a sanitized version of it that's kind of minimal.
So, John, I don't disagree completely with you. I mean, if we have to implement network policy, or if we decide to implement network policy, I don't think we have too many choices except to send the labels, because that involves source and destination labels, and I don't think there is any other way to use it. How about we kind of split the baby, or however it's called? We define a workload with labels. It's not very difficult to put in HTOD, and it doesn't have any cost in HTOD. And we also implement filtering on HTOD based on workloads. And on the matter of protocol, if we implement selection in HTOD, obviously will be a small change in what the protocol we have today. but we can still reuse the rest of the protocol. So the when, where, I mean, all the structure of the protocol will be the same, but we'll add this, you know, kind of, instead of sending the label selectors, we'll send the label, the workload ID or whatever HTOD is using. Oh, sorry, zTunnel is using.
Can we add labels later if we need them? Like, why do that now?
Let's put them there. I mean, it's a small change, and again, it's not, so we don't have this discussion again, basically. So we'll have ability to get labels if we need them, debugging, telemetry, whatever, network policy. If someone wants to implement network policies, that will be the only way. I think we agree that, you know, we don't have the same luxury with network policy where we just have 5 things that we need, version.
Yeah, I think I agree with Costin. Label will be very valuable in many places, like telemetry. I'm pretty sure we will need to send labels associated with the workloads.
Wait,
But
That's not
just
true.
a second,
Like,
yeah.
we have already
Okay.
established that we only need a certain fields for telemetry. Telemetry is already implemented, so this is not theoretical. There are very specific attributes we need for telemetry. Those are already sent. That's orthogonal from sending labels. So let's not mix those up.
Yeah, I'd
No.
like to see a concrete scenario where we need label before we can add a
Network
label,
policy.
right?
Network policy.
Network policy. But if we translate, so I think you want to add a label because you want to send the OSC policy from the control plane to the
No.
data plane. No?
No. So for a VM, again, right now in Kubernetes, let's say the CNI layer is implementing network policy, and you can allow from pods with labels X and deny from pods with label Y. If we run zTunnel on a VM or outside Kubernetes, we either lose network policy, so the VMs will not obey network policy, or implement network policy in zTunnel. To implement network policy in zTunnel, we'll need to support arbitrary labels, because unfortunately, network policy is based on arbitrary labels on source and destination.
Yeah, but you can get the label information for the co-located pods, like you said, right? We don't need to send that from the control plane.
For network policy, you need source and destination labels, unfortunately. So you need to get both. So basically,
Okay, so source doesn't locate it on the same node.
But that's fine. It doesn't impact the protocol and client. It will be just a slightly different resource that returns same information plus labels. So normally we don't pay any cost. But if someone decides to implement network policy or something that requires labels, whatever, I mean, telemetry, extra, or then we have the ability to get it relatively easily. I don't think it's a bad thing in any way. It doesn't hurt anyone.
Yeah, but to Ethan's point, which I think a lot of people agree, we want to keep zTunnel as minimum as possible, right? So it's almost feel we would add stuff when we know we absolutely need it.
In HTOD, I don't think we need to keep HTOD as simple as possible, because
yeah, I mean, for zTunnel, yeah.
I'm saying expose it, and maybe it will not be implemented in zTunnel. Maybe the network policy will be implemented with some other mechanism. Who knows?
So we have the workload API, and in workload API, in the workload definition, do we have the set of labels, or John said it's only specific labels, not including all the labels?
We do not have the labels.
And what Costin is proposing is to add the labels, if I'm hearing correctly, right?
Not the workload identity with labels. Let's define a new protocol.
Yeah, workload with
labels. And HTOD will support both. If someone wants to know what labels, then they get it with labels.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So they could opt in to get without label if they don't care about the label.
Oh, default will be without labels. I mean, but if you need network policy or need to implement some policies that requires label, we have it there for. But that's a different discussion. I mean, I think we agreed now that HTOD will do selection like originally proposed. So it's just a matter of how do we express the rest of the protocol, basically.
Okay. I see a couple of hands. I want to make sure we get to them. Shanka, is that you? Okay, maybe not. Ethan, did you also have a hand?
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't know whose decision this is, but stepping back, to me, it really sounds like there's not an immediate use case for labels. I'd say 70% buy the argument that we'll need it if we implement network policy. I want to get this thing out the door quickly, so removing features is better. So I would we can always add them later. So I would propose that we file a bug on it, put it in the backlog, but like say no labels, at least in the alpha release. I guess my meta question is how do we like how do we arrive at a short-term resolution on this? Like, is there maybe not unanimous consensus, but is there a majority consensus on this path? Or
I don't think we have any major disagreement, Ethan. I mean, I think most of us understand what we may need labels. We have a way to add labels, and it's pretty simple. We don't have to do it now. And this proposal is not blocked necessarily on the labels. I mean, so only issue that we still have with this proposal is if we do. I mean, it's clear we'll do selection in STOD because we need to do it anyway for optimization. Do we send the proto that we have with the name of the workload that match, or instead of the label? So basically, just substitute the workload selector with a concrete ID, or do we redefine the entire thing?
sorry, say that last sentence one more time. I didn't quite grok it.
So do we send the existing authorization policy as it is today defined, except replace the workload selector with a list of selected pods that STOD will select? So STOD takes the labels, does the matching, and send to the tunnel, hey, I have this policy to apply to pod 1, 2, 3, 4 by IP, by whatever identifier we can come. I don't know how we can, but the rest remains the same. I mean, the rest of the proto. Or we define another representation of the proto, which is, closer to something. I don't know, like we do it with Envoy.
Yeah, and I'm not the one to answer that.
Yeah, I think for the workload selection, I think most of us already arrived at rough consensus, right? We can, as Costin just said, we can have the set of pods selected by STOD, to basically to replace the label selection, label selector in control plane. And the other thing we want to discuss is the RBAC rules. How do we represent it? Do we want to? I think there are two options that I think is possible. We can move forward. One is directly copy the control plane proto. Just remove the L7 properties, only send the L4 properties. And the other possibility, which I can see, which I mentioned in one of the comments, is maybe we can consider something similar to what is implemented in Envoy RBAC proto today. Envoy RBAC, I'm not saying we should use everything in Envoy RBAC because currently it has like principal permission, and we don't need this distinguishing. But the part of that I like about Envoy RBAC is it has unlimited nested and or combinations. So you can have any combinations of and or of the properties.
But that's
and the implementation is actually pretty efficient. The code, if you look at the code, it's very short, but it's extremely flexible.
Limit, I think what you listed as the pro is a con. Doing more than we want is just an attack surface, place for bugs, etc. And I don't agree that it's efficient in implementation. I mean, I sent you a link to the example of a simple policy that becomes like 300 lines of code. It's doing regexes to do simple things that don't need regexes, for example. Like we can have a much more optimized implementation by being
John, that's
specific.
Yeah, that's generated config instead of the code. The code is actually very simple.
Right. So my concern
basically
is twofold.
recursion.
The generated config is what's sent over the wire. So any large proto is extremely expensive.
That's what we need, right? We need at least 2 levels of and or. Maybe more. I need to look at the policy.
Basically my argument is that we should have the most efficient, simplest form over the wire, right? If that ends up looking like Envoy, that's fine. It's not going to be the same as Envoy, I almost guarantee, but it's actually very simple. This is not subjective. We can quantitatively go and test out 2 protos and see how efficient they are, right? It's a very simple single number output. So if we want, we can go test out side by side and prove it. We don't need to, kind of debate over it. On the other hand, the actual implementation, I am very confident that we can implement something more efficient than a regex to do what we need to do.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we want to remove the parts that like regex or anything we think that's unsafe, and we don't support it anyway in Istio API.
No, but
I feel like we're almost agreeing, because we were saying we want to take Envoy and strip out all the parts we need to get an efficient representation, and that's exactly what I'm saying as well, I guess. So
yeah.
My only thing is that I don't care at all about sticking anywhere similar to Envoy if it's not the most efficient. I only care that we end up efficient. But if it looks like Envoy without the bad parts of it, that's perfectly fine with me.
Okay, yeah.
So maybe we're more agreement than disagreement. Go ahead, Costin.
Oh, sorry, Ethan is before. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
I don't think my hand was up.
No, it was
Right.
Eitan. Eitan, did you have a
Oh.
hand?
Yeah, Ethan, come on. No, I was just gonna say, you said that the one goal is the efficiency over the wire, but you had also said that we want to keep the code in the Z tunnel as simple as possible. So the one goal cannot be.
All right, you caught me in a lie. I meant to say
not that I'm catching you in a lie, but I just want to make sure that even like it almost feels to me that the efficiency over the wire is secondary to the simplicity of the implementation in the Z tunnel.
I think it's a balance of the simplicity on the control plane, on the data plane, and over the wire.
Okay. Fair point. I just want to make sure that we're not making, because if it's the efficiency over it, then Envoy's API makes sense, because it's like, or whatever, like then it's a different goal. So I just want to make sure that
Quick interjection with a meta point. Often with projects like these, it's maybe not a bad idea to write down what the goals and non-goals are. I think we could write down and agree on 4 or 5 of them. So maybe that might be a good thing to do out of hand.
Even if they're conflicting, yes. So one point here is we go down. It's a rabbit hole basically. I mean, we'll keep discussing for many months what is the most efficient wire versus whatever versus Envoy, what is bad in Envoy, how a general purpose language can be optimized, and then we'll have to, because Envoy is basically an expression language that is evaluated and so forth. How about pragmatically just start with what we have in Istio API, because that's exactly what it's a minimum thing we need to support. So anything we add to it will be extra that is, effort and testing. And if later someone, 6 months from now, someone will have an WASM representation or eBPF translation or whatever fancy language, intermediary language they want to define, and they prove that it's more efficient than what we have, we can go with it. We can swap it. It's implementation detail. But to get started, I don't think the current protos that we have in Istio are difficult in Rust to parse and create some data structures that work efficiently, because it's.
Yeah, I would say the only challenge I have is, so folks, 2 weeks ago, we would discuss this topic, right? And on that call, everybody was kind of prefer there needs to be some internal representation of authorization policy for layer 4, right? So that's the path Yossi has been going through, and I think Yossi have some prototype that's working on his machine. So for number 1 is folks already made some progress by Yossi. Number 2 is from the requirement of the call 2 weeks ago, I think we made it clear whatever internal representative we want to come up with, we need to cover not only the Istio auth policy, but also the network policy for potential down the road, which is why another argument point that we believe the internal representation is needed for a case, because the RBAC, Istio RBAC couldn't cover the network policy.
Yeah, that's nothing is wrong here. I mean, everything is still true. We do want at some point to have an intermediate representation that can represent whatever. I think we don't disagree that eventually we need to implement network policy, but it will be a different proposal, and maybe we'll send network policy on the wire. But to get things moving and to not get bogged into discussion about what is the most efficient and future-proof and can implement network policy representation, we could just, do the minimal things that is required to get it supported,
Yeah, I think network policy can be the next goal. It's probably not the one we've tried to optimize in the first implementation. Network policy actually include what Costin said, the source labels. Source labels can be used to identify the client, and it's probably not the goal we want to achieve in our first version. And yeah, I think one of the important goals is in cTunnel, we should try to optimize for implementation efficiency. That's why I was talking about the existing MY RBAC, like you can handle the embedded, like any level of and/or combination very easily, like using very short code. Otherwise, you have to duplicate the logic like in several levels. If you need 2 levels, 3 levels, you basically duplicate the same logic every time you need to generate the and/or logic. So yeah, of course, I'm not saying I already, yeah, like the previous discussion with John, I'm not saying we want to duplicate everything in MY RBAC. Like we don't want the permissions principal differentiation, and we don't want to include the regex. Yeah, we can only include the minimum sets.
You'll
Go
see.
ahead. Go ahead, Yusuf.
Yeah, go ahead. You've been doing a lot of work. We should definitely let you chime in, and you should be weighing on simplicity from a coding perspective too. You're muted, Yossi.
I'm just saying that it's a great discussion, and I'm actually leaning toward the suggestion of Costin, because what Costin is suggesting is that we will use the current protobuf of the authorization policy as a vehicle, or as the message to be passed on the wire. And we will clean up the irrelevant parts from there. I mean, we will clean up the layer 7 policy. We don't care about those. And we will also replace the selectors with something which zTunnel can understand. And all the logic that we need is already there. I mean, the and, the nose, and whatever the user defines, this is what the user defines. So we don't need to convert that into the envoy RBAC representation or something that I defined in the design token. So I kind of like it. I mean, if everybody else are in favor of that.
As a first step, at least. I mean, I don't think we are saying, or anyone is saying, that optimization cannot come later, or, you know, generate eBPF, WASM, or whatever is not possible in the future. But let's ship something.
Can we turn this into a written proposal? And I think that would help. I'm having trouble agreeing to something because I'm having trouble holding in my head what we're agreeing to.
Yeah, Yossi, maybe you can show us some example how you plan to implement it. Then we can see, yeah, if the logic makes sense. My biggest concern is if you directly implement the control plane proto, will the implementation code become pretty complicated? Yeah, maybe you can just go through. Well, when you're ready, you can show us the examples. How do you plan to enforce these control plane rules directly?
I mean, a quick question, a quick comment. His demo, I mean, his implementation and doc, the format is about the same thing that we have. I mean, it's not, the implementation will not change too much. So it's really just different names and different proto for pretty much the same thing.
Right. Yeah, I actually commented on the RBAC policy rules in Yossi's doc. I gave one example. I think, of the policy of the current control plane policy. I think it's actually in the current proposal. There's only one level of and/or, so it's not possible to implement some of the policy we already support today.
But if you take the policy as it is, so you don't need to convert that into the logic of the RBAC message, right?
Yeah, but still, you need to have the logic implemented in the code for multiple levels of N and R.
Yeah, it will be. It should be.
Yeah. Another point I made is because currently we're still going to support sidecar, so we are going to have some logic to converge to the Envoy RBAC. So the logic already exists today. Maybe we can have some shared logic for both ambient and the sidecar. And the data plane implementation can also be, actually the Envoy RBAC implementation is pretty simple. That's what I can see. But maybe we can go through the concrete policy examples, and the UC can show us how the policy can be enforced using custom logic.
I was going through the proto and I was disturbed to find that it sounds like we can do prefix and suffix matches on any field. That includes like namespace. Is that accurate?
We can do suffix and prefix match
and IPs?
Any field, including namespace and IP. Yes. Is there a concern?
A concern on a suffix match on an IP address?
IP, we actually support CIDR IP blocks.
So, John, it is a V1 API. We promoted it to stable. I don't think we can change it.
I don't. Yeah, I was just making sure that we implement it if that's what it. That's what.
And we'll have to implement it as much as possible. I mean, but with Envoy is that we doubles. I mean, it's even more craziness that it's coming with Envoy because it's basically an expression language that it can be as complicated as far more complicated than that we have already. So
yeah. We don't have to support the whole Envoy. Yeah, but like whatever functionality supported in Envoy.
But why bother with it if it's exactly the same what we have in Istio policies, then we implement it directly. Otherwise, if it's more, then we already waste time on something more.
Okay, so taking a step back, in this specific meeting, what outcome are we driving to? So I think there's a decision that needs to be made. I can't tell if that decision was made or not. So what's the next step to arriving at a decision?
Yeah, so I think the key. Yeah, go ahead. I was trying to recap what decision needs to be made, so we're on the same page. So I think one of the big decision point as Yossi was implementing layer 4 authorization policies for zTunnel, he needs to decide what is the contract between the control plane to zTunnel, right? So one proposal on the table was there's an internal representation, which I think everyone reviewed 2 weeks ago. Now costing is more feeling strongly about why not just reuse the existing OSCE policy from Istio and have that be sent to the zTunnel, and then zTunnel can process there. I think that's the thing we're trying to figure out. And it looks like Yossi kind of agree that's the easiest way to get started. Although there is a little bit challenging of would that work for network policy down the road. But if we're okay with, just supporting what Istio supports right now, worry about network policy down the road when we need to implement, it might be a reasonable starting point. That's what, I think we're trying to decide. And let me know if I missed anything.
And John's like the principal person who disagrees with that path. Is that right?
I'm not sure if John disagrees now.
As well, but I don't want to put words in his mouth.
Okay.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, if UC can just show us the implementation is efficient to just directly use the control plane protocol, I'm okay with that.
Okay, so
my worry is
okay, let's do that.
Yeah, my biggest worry is with the embedded NNR logic, the implementation may not be that efficient. And it's actually not sufficient from the current proposed protocol. That's what I can see.
Yeah, I just want to expand on that to make sure that's not the only concern. I'm also concerned that it's not going to be safe to implement correctly. The OSCE API is like a bunch of stuff that is not relevant to zTunnel, and it's complicated. It has all sorts of string parsing that needs to be done. as much as we can avoid parsing things in the Z tunnel, there's less opportunity for CVEs. It's much more efficient, etc. So I'd much prefer that the Z tunnel just gets a minimum representation. Because remember, if the Z tunnel gets the auth policy, it's going to need to process that into some other form internally so that it can use it against requests. I imagine that for each request, it's not going to go through the actual original authorization policy as is and like try and compute whether it matches, right? It's going to have to convert it to its own form anyways. So I'd much rather have most of that conversion be done by that control plane into an efficient form that's efficient both over the wire, easier for Z-tunnel to understand. I don't think it saves us much time by using the current one because we're still going to have to convert it. It's just whether or not it becomes a proto or not, which is largely an internal implementation detail.
But, Yoshi, go ahead.
So the next step to drive to a decision.
I think Yoshi is speaking, but he's muted.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I think the authorization policy that John, the Z-tunnel process will not have will not have to do the processing that you refer to, because this is the part that istio will do. I mean, taking the selectors and namespaces, prefixes, and names prefixes, those are kind of selectors information.
The proposal that I was arguing against was to send the authorization policy as is. So I'm not sure how we can say that the control plane is going to do work ahead of time to process these things if we're sending it as is.
No, I think really. I misunderstood the part because I thought that the suggestion was that the selectors part will be done by the istio and the authorization policy will be passed as is without the relevant layer 7 part, but as is without the Z-tunnel need of the Z-tunnel to do the processing of the selector itself.
There's still parsing to be done though. All the fields, even in the L4 fields, the OSCE policy represents everything as a string. So we may represent a CIDR as a string. We may represent an IP as a string. We may represent a prefix as a string, right? We need to process all that. And if we're saying that we're stripping out all the L7 fields, we're either just stripping them out from the actual contents, but not the proto, in which case Z-tunnel has to handle those in some way, right? Does it just ignore like 90% of the fields and pretend they don't exist? Maybe, but it's a bit suspicious from a design point of view. If we actually change the proto to actually remove those, then we're basically making our own proto and we might as well optimize it more than just stripping out fields.
But it needs to be equivalent to that. So we need to guarantee that whatever is the result is functionally equivalent to what we have, and we are not adding more stuff, because that was my concern with inventing a new protocol like Envoy filter, is that we may make it more complicated than it is. I don't think I'm against converting strings to numbers and sending them in a more efficient part. My concern was about changing the semantics of the authorization policy and creating something that is more generic and more complicated than what we have.
I think the internal representation should make the implementation easier. Whatever the implementation,
That's
whatever
the
we
goal.
decide.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So the reason I'm talking about Envoy RBAC is not saying we need to have a different proto to align with what Envoy has. It's basically making the implementation much easier. Basically, the Envoy RBAC proto is optimized for processing this embedded and OR logic. That's totally designed for machine to consume to easy to enforce the recursion logic.
I mean,
that's the talk.
I strongly disagree that Envoy implementation is efficient. I mean, efficient would mean to use tree and all kinds of efficient data structures to map the CIDRs. There are a lot of other things that go into efficiency, not necessarily writing an interpreter that is implementing some AND/OR and other things recursively.
Yeah, it's not the only efficient implementation, I would say, but it is pretty. It's well tested and it's currently proved to be efficient to implement in Envoy.
Hey,
and
Louis,
it's not just the Envoy. there are some gRPC library also use the same logic.
Yeah, hey Louis, I want to make sure, are you the one raising the hand? I want to make sure you have the mic because you've been pretty vocal in the chats too. Oh, you don't have audio. Okay,
Okay.
got you.
While we're waiting for Louis to jump on, I do think like the next step for making a decision here is if we're going to change the API to get a written proposal, because now I can sense that we're actually debating about different things. Like I'm not sure we're on the same page about even what's being proposed. So I'd like for someone to leave this meeting with an AI to do that. Probably shouldn't be me because I don't think I agree with it, but
Yeah, I saw
someone who
Louis
agrees
said-
with it should write it.
Yeah, hopefully you've seen that there's a big doc that is already proposing all this. I mean, there's updates from
maybe
this
I
meeting,
missed it.
but it's quite far along in the design
Oh, okay. So the
process.
proposal
That's-
essentially followed
yeah.
this document.
That's Yossi's doc, right? At the end, I think
I
John
got
helped us taking meeting minutes. There was like 4 options from last meeting 2 weeks ago. Louis, go ahead. Pass the mic to you.
Oh, yeah. So, Costin, it sounds like most people think that there should be a tailored representation, right? I think, right, and there are a variety of reasons for that, right? Even if we ignore the selection mechanism, there are other normalizations of the data that need to occur for the Z-tunnel to be able to perform its work. Like when we talk about comparing identities, right, we're going to have to do forms of normalization of IDs, right, in the API, right, whether it's a workload ID, whether it's a principal ID, right, we are going to have to compute those, right, and those are not directly represented in the currently public-facing API, the .c policy. So we're going to end up with an internal representation anyway, right, a more downward-facing API. So I think what we should do is we can start structurally with what we have, right, but fork it, and then work on iterating the representations to be more easily implementable by the Z-tunnel.
Yep.
Right, so the control plane still has to do work. Like we're all in agreement, the workload selection, like that can't be done in Z-tunnel, right, for a variety of reasons. We know we're going to have representational changes anyway to simplify the work for Z-tunnel over time, right, particularly normalizing identifiers, right, IDs. And at some point, we expect the Z-tunnel to do things that are not currently in the Auth-Z API, either network policy or egress policy. Right? So we may as well fork it now and let it evolve because it's not very complicated for the control plane to do the translation. Now, we do carry a testing debt, but we already carried that anyway, right? Because we have to do all the functional testing for this no matter what versus the public API.
Yeah. I completely, I mean, forking it as it is and optimizing and changing, to have more efficient representation, as long as it's equivalent and is not moving us into the direction of Envoy, which is a expression language. I mean, it's basically kind of cell and other expression.
Yeah, I don't know if we need an expression language as opposed to just a declarative policy, right? I think that's a separate topic that we can answer separately from this, which is the representational discussion.
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly fine with optimizing. I mean, to have a slightly equivalent functionality but different representation, more optimal, whole for it. I mean, it's clearly easier, better, and it's not changing what I'm. I mean, my concern was having an expression language basically sneaked into. I mean, an eBPF sneaked into this proto basically.
I agree with you, Costin, and I don't think the current proposed proto does that. And also, the actual user-facing Auth-Z one it has an expression language. So that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to use it, was specifically that. So
yeah, it has condition, right? Which is cell.
Yeah. I don't think it does full cell expression. Does
No,
it?
it's a limited subset.
Okay, yeah.
But it's still logically cell, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Wait, which ones? Envoy one is close to cell.
No, the authorization policy user-facing API, you can do things like, I'll send an example.
Yeah, the from, to, and where. The where is an
but it has
expression.
only 5 fields, so it's not completely arbitrary, and that's really where we are getting. I mean, if we have something that are arbitrary expression, then it becomes cell. As it is, you can translate it. Well, yeah, I guess you are right. It's still a translation, but it's a scope that I'm concerned about, because today, yes, it's where, but it only have 5 different things that you can put there, and none of them really applies here.
Yeah, it's the
You can put
authorization.
anything. You
Does
can
not
put any attribute you want there, Gustin.
No, the documentation is clear that only those 5 attributes are supported. In
Right, but
we-
we'd still have to parse them and then say like, oh, that's one of the ones we don't want and stuff. So I'd much rather have the control plane parse it and just send us,
I'm
like-
afraid to parse them on, John, I'm perfectly okay to parse them and to do optimization, just not to allow arbitrary expressions. Basically. That's,
No, absolutely. I think we want ztunnel to not be arbitrary. We want it to be the least generic API. Oh, not the least generic, but like that's kind of the intent of the workload as well, right? We're not putting labels just because they're there and we can. We're putting the fields we need and only the fields we need to implement the ztunnel. So I think we should do the same for.
yeah, I think that was the same.
I think so too.
Yep.
So Yossi, I think you have a direction, right, at a high level.
Yeah, I was going to agree. I was going to say it seems like the outstanding concern really is that the proto as is maybe can't represent all the current states of the API, but I think that's minor issues, not fundamental issues. So we'll just need to make some tweaks to the proto. But then to me, it looks good to me once we do that. So.
Okay. So I think we
Okay,
can go
cool.
with the existing proto since it's tested and prototype and then extend it with whatever is missing. And make sure we
Okay.
don't expand the scope. I mean, we don't add anything that will represent something that is not represented in the API until we have a clear need for it.
Okay, cool. Sounds like we have consensus. Yossi, do you want to say anything?
No. There is one more question that I'm not sure if 5 minutes is enough to discuss that, but there is this simulator that John did of the comparison whether we will have the references in the workloads or vice versa. And I know that in the last meeting we agreed that we will have the references in the rules, the RBAC resources themselves, but John simulator showed slightly, or I guess slightly more efficient if we will have the references from the workloads to the rules. Still open question. So do we want to decide on that, or we want to postpone that to a later stage? I know that maybe on the implementation side, it will not have like huge differences, but if there is like a clear answer that we want to provide now, it will be better.
John, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I like the proposal that's in the doc right now, but I think I'm a bit biased because I think that was what I suggested. So I don't think my opinion is terribly useful beyond that.
So was it Louis who has a different input on that?
Actually, what we have today in the document is the rules reference in the workloads, right? Because we have the workloads field in the
Oh, we do.
inside
I
the-
see. I was assuming this to do was done.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I added a comment. Yeah, just to show an example saying that the current proto probably cannot be used to express all the existing instance isolation policy.
I think that's a different concern, Lehman. We're talking about how to say that this policy applies to this workload, not the actual rules themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, previously we
Rules
agreed that
is
we would
separate,
update it
okay.
to make sure, obviously it has to be able to
Mhm.
represent all of them, so we'll make sure that that happens, and that was a good call out that we're.
Sorry, it's been a while since I looked at the doc. Is the current, the options are either the workload refers to the rules by reference, the rule gets embedded in the workload, right? So it's not by reference, or there's the workload references, sorry, the rule references the workload set, right? Those are the 3 construction options.
I think we've narrowed it down and refined them a bit. So we know for that global or namespace rules, there's no need for anything to be in the workload. So the question is for workload selector rules, what do we do? And one option is to put a list of workloads in the OSCE policy. And the other one is to say in the policy, this is a workload selector one, defer to the workloads, and then put the list of workload selector rules in the workload. So it's a bit wonky because you, like the implementation, like in some cases you look only at the rule, in some cases you look at both. The reason why we did it was we did some simulation of, in terms of churn of things updating, like because policies are bigger, and it ends up being that it's a bit more efficient to update put it in the workloads because policies don't change often, but workloads do change often. So basically anywhere we have a big list of workloads, we're running into tricky territory because now anytime one of those workloads changes, which is often, we have to push
It's the same as the service, right?
Exactly. Exact same thing.
So basically you're saying workload back reference to policy is probably the best.
Yes, but scoped. So like the common cases, you have a namespace bound, and there's no need to have that, which would also increase.
Yeah, I mean, a workload has a back reference to a namespace. Effectively, the namespace can have a back reference to a set of policies. Yeah, that's
Instead of having workloads have labels, we have workloads have references to policies. It's
all right, folks. I'm getting kicked out of my room.
Yeah.
Okay, so John, just making sure I understand, you are saying this is more efficient based on your test?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
One more point on what Levin was saying about it's not representing the full power of Istio API that we have today. We need to identify what is not supported for sure, but we could as well have a discussion if we want to support the full power, because it's an L4 policy. User is aware that there are some changes. We need to document that some attributes are not going to be supported. So we have an opportunity to simplify as well and to reduce the scope.
In the doc, there's a list of what parts, like what attributes are supported, which is obviously the L4 part. I think the thing that Min was worried isn't representable is some of the, like there's a bunch of like and ors basically, and basically some set of those. I feel like it may be a bit odd to restrict those.
Yeah.
Either we support them or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm not talking about the properties, L7 properties we need to remove, but it's basically the level, how to express the and or combinations. That part I think we need to support.
Well, let's get merged what we have today. I mean, what Yoshi had, and then we can iterate and add what is missing.
Okay, that sounds good. Sounds like we have a plan. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead, John.
I just had one question. We don't even necessarily need to answer it here. You can just think on it and discuss later. Do we, for identities, I'm curious what we want to support. I feel like there's three options. Is one, Istio shaped spiffy, arbitrary spiffy, or arbitrary anything. Today we only support the Istio shaped spiffy that has, the namespace and service account in the shape that we expect.
Actually, for the principle, the only thing we pass is only when we need to support the namespace level policy. Then we.
I don't mean Istio today. I mean in Ambient and ztunnel and whatnot.
But isn't Ambient the first target is for Istio policy?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
No, but it's also the authorization. The other side, you need client authorizing server, so secure naming.
Yeah, the secure naming was the main thing actually.
And secure naming does already. The destination rule does support arbitrary sun. You can put.
But destination rule won't be impacted by ztunnels. Ztunnels won't read destination rule.
I mean, if you have a L4, doesn't have to verify the identity of the peer and doesn't respect destination rule service sun.
No, it does not. It's always using hbone. If you want to configure destination rule to add that would be like a waypoint or sidecar level config.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So even for layer 4 traffic shifting, Because I thought that's in zTunnel. I mean, I know it wasn't implemented.
zTunnel only does OTC policy. That's the only API. it supports.
Oh, okay. Because if you read our initial launch blog, I think we had, Justin will know for sure, I think we had layer for routing as well in zTunnel, in the layer for layer.
I don't think I would have let that go out on the blog. Let me see.
I mean, unless I got it wrong.
It just says TCP routing. It doesn't mean that it's customizable.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Uh,
TCP routing. Okay, you're right. It's not customizable, but still for TCP routing, right? Which will be layer for routing.
Sure, we route it, but you can't customize it with any APIs.
So John,
Okay.
I mean, Istio API is probably good enough to get started, but I mean, Istio Sans, Spiffy,
Yeah.
whatever. But I think if zTunnel is to be interoperable and to work with other vendors and to be adopted by JK gateway vendors and so forth, we need to give some flexibility in secure naming at least. When, you know,
I think you're probably right. The current implementation doesn't, because we don't actually send the identity as like an opaque string. We send the service account and namespace, and we actually elide that in some cases as an optimization. But we can probably,
trust-domain alias it's getting nasty if you don't.
yeah.
would
Oh
say.
yeah, aliases too. Forgot about that. Yeah. Okay. That probably makes sense. Thanks.
All right, are we done?
Yep.
Thanks everyone for joining. Happy holidays. Bye now. See you next year.